Wow, good afternoon, everyone. That was an absolute privilege to watch again. I had the honor of being able to sneak peek it, but it really does hit me harder every time. So it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chee. I'm an attorney here in Houston at a firm called Coleman, but John and I are part of an organization called Stop Repeating History, which is an organization dedicated to education and engagement around these issues of civil rights and racial justice, and also the harms and the perpetual threat of prejudice in our society. So with that, I want to introduce my really esteemed panelists. We got to see the two of you in the film, and John is our esteemed filmmaker. First is Mike Ishii. He is a co-founder and organizer for Tsuru for Solidarity. And in addition to his leadership at Tsuru for Solidarity, Mike's been a co-chair of the New York Day of Remembrance Committee for 30 years, and also a co-chair of the New York Japanese American Oral History Project. Mike splits his time as a performing artist, organizer, and clinician, where he explores themes of remembrance, healing, and resiliency. John Osaki, who we got to hear from earlier, is the award-winning filmmaker who produced this amazing documentary, Not Your Model Minority, along with other documentary films, including Alternative Facts, The Lies of Executive Order 96-6, and Reparations. John's initial interest in film grew from his desire to share the stories of the Japanese Community Youth Council, JCYC, where he has served as the executive director since 1996. John views film as the next step in his lifelong pursuit of social justice and equity, and it shows. And last but certainly not least is Professor Ellen Wu, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at Indiana University, where she researches, teaches, and writes about race, migration, and belonging in U.S. history. She's the author of The Color of Success, Asian Americans and the Origins of the Model Minority, and she's a founding member of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum Indiana chapter. She's served on the board of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and the Indiana Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So with that, thank you all so much for being here. It is truly an honor to share the virtual stage with you and to continue the conversation from what you've already given thoughts on during the film. And if I could just kick it off with you, John, I wanted to hear from you about the process and the vision that you had when you first set about making this film. What one of the interviewees mentioned, and it's quite accurate, and I think it was Ellen, that this narrative of the model minority myth got hijacked somewhere along American history. And what was it about the current narrative or the media and the available resources about the model minority myth that inspired you to want to choose this as a topic and tell it in the way that you told it?
Sure. Well, thanks for that question. And I think for me, so just a little bit about my day job, I like to call it, is I serve as executive director for the Japanese Community Youth Council in San Francisco. And our organization was founded by some of those same young people who were part of the Third World Strike at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. And so our whole foundation as an organization was created around solidarity, around working with other communities, around lifting each other up and really fighting for each other. And, I started to notice over the last couple years that in conversations around communities of color, Asian Americans weren't always in those conversations, weren't always highlighted as a community of color working with other communities. And I felt for me that was odd because our orientation had always been to work closely with the Black community, Latinx community, and other Asian ethnic communities. So I think that for this film, I really wanted to unpack how these narratives have really created harm, have really created these divisions. And I think as Asian Americans, it's so important, especially in this time, this renewed time where we are a target, where we're being scapegoated as communities, that we really understand those dynamics, how they've happened, and what type of steps we need to take to move forward to address them. Because I think that unfortunately, the forces that promote systemic racism in this country have been incredibly successful. They've been very successful at dividing our communities, at pitting us against each other. And so I think that it is so important that we go back and understand how this whole myth originated, the harm it's created, and to really think critically about what is the way forward, what are steps we can take to begin to address this, to begin to heal divisions between communities of color so that we can collectively build power with each other. And I'm just really grateful to Mike and Ellen for joining me here today. One of the things I make sure that I do in my films is I interview people who are a lot smarter than me. I learned a great deal from them, and I'm just so pleased that they were part of this project and could really help analyze and examine this issue and help us understand how there have been incidences over the years where we have been complicit in this system of systemic racism and how we need to take steps to address it.
And I want to ask the other two panelists following up on that, when starting with you, Professor Wu, when you were first approached to participate in the documentary, what were your expectations? What story did you expect to be asked about? And what were your hopes that your participation might mean to John and to the community?
Sure. Thank you, Heaven. I just want to thank John and Mike and everybody for being here today to watch together. It's really fun to do it sort of all in real time. But as far as the question about expectations, when John contacted me, I thought that what I could provide was just really the historical background. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to remind people that Asian Americans in this entire process of, of the creation and the reproduction of this stereotype and also challenging it, that all along the way, Asian Americans have been active participants. And that is not something I think people always realize or recognize. It wasn't just something that was dumped on our communities, but that, we've been part of this you might say conversational process. So I suppose I didn't expect to actually be, I guess, a real talking so much in the film, but I do hope that sharing that historical context is useful to everybody thinking through this problem together.
Thank you, Professor. Mike, may I ask the same of you, how you reacted and what you were hoping to share when you were first approached by John to participate?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm very flattered and honored to be on a panel with Professor Wu and John Osaki. And it's such an honor to be a part of this project. So thank you for the invitation to participate. When I was approached by John, it really made me think a lot about my own community, which is the Japanese American community, and my own family history. Cynthia Choi, who is an amazing AAPI leader in the film, she says something about, people were shocked about anti-AAPI violence during the pandemic, and this isn't the America I know. And she sort of very clearly states firmly, this is American history. This is very, very much a part of the long history of America, which is violence towards communities of color and towards people of AAPI descent. And so when I was approached to be a part of this film, I really thought about that a lot. And I'm so glad that John really connected model minority dynamic with the violence that has been targeted, because in my own community, what I sort of grew up watching was the aftermath of the World War II concentration camp experience. And really what I saw was that there was an incredible terror and fear in my family and in my community about being targeted in that way. And what if they do this to us again? And there was just this sense that it wasn't okay to be Asian, it wasn't okay to be Japanese. And so there was this decision, I don't know that it was an aware decision, but it was a decision that evolved over time, which was to move away from being who we were, to basically erase ourselves and move toward proximity of whiteness. And I think that my community is one of the communities that becomes really a very central cog in the model minority myth and dynamic. And what people don't often understand is that the decisions that people made to participate in that conversation, as Professor Wu kind of clearly outlined, often comes out of a history of trauma and racism and violence. And so if there's anything that I was hoping that would come out of my participation in this project, and I think it's such a beautiful outcome, this film, it's that people see the links between how you move from being in a group that is very targeted to being moved into a collaborator role, and that often comes out of the violence and the trauma.
Thank you for that. And I want to follow up on that because someone in our audience asked this, and there's no time like the present because I was hoping to ask you all this question anyways, Mike. But Anthony asked, like, how do we stop AAPI hate without harming other communities of color? And I was planning to ask you that anyways because I wanted to hear about your efforts to be part of that facilitating role, that partnership role, that true ally role, as opposed to the wedge role that we've been pigeonholed into. Can you tell us about your efforts in the grassroots? Like, what are the issues that you're engaging generally, and how do you frame those? How do you make sure that people in our community understand that those are issues that affect all of us, not just us as AAPIs, and not just, and also, like, how do you get AAPIs to engage with issues that aren't commonly thought of as our problems?
Well, I'll try to be brief here, and then let's hear from others. But what I would just quickly say is that I can speak as a Japanese American heritage person, 4th generation. And what happened as a result of the mass incarceration of my community was that there are certain narratives that evolved sort of as a defensive posture afterwards, trying to basically uphold the dignity and the goodness of our people who, because we had been sort of portrayed as the evil, cunning, yellow-skinned rats, that need to be locked up and taken away from society. And so that kind of targeting really impacted our community. And there was these narratives that emerged of like being good citizens. And in the movie, you saw Mike Masaoka talking about things like that. And if you understand why that happened, then really what we're involved in at this moment is a deconstruction of that narrative history. And so in my organization, Tsuru for Solidarity, for instance, we have a Japanese American abolition study group that was set up very specifically to give our community opportunities to try to talk about the ways that we have been sort of inculcated into a white supremacist narrative around good and bad people, good and bad citizens. And for instance, even just saying, like, often they say, that the majority of Japanese Americans who were put in concentration camps were American citizens. As if it's okay to incarcerate or trample the rights of immigrants, but not citizens. And so, just in those very subtle kinds of statements, you see this sort of other communities of color, and sort of an elevation of ourselves as good people. And so we are very, very involved in a community conversation, trying to understand how we've been used against the African American community and other communities. And I'll just quickly say that before, and in particular after World War II, in urban areas, particularly on the West Coast, those were the only neighborhoods that Japanese Americans were really allowed to return to because of redlining practices. And so we were taken in by the Black community when we returned from the concentration camps. And yet what happened was then we were allowed to assimilate, to move up in economic sort of social strata. And the Black community was not allowed to do that. And there were relationships that were built in those times, and there were resources that were offered to our community, and yet then we sort of turned our back and we participated in the model minority dynamic. And those are the kinds of conversations that we're trying to actually have with authenticity and honesty in this moment.
That's so insightful, and that's so interesting from a historic perspective. I didn't know that about the Japanese communities in California when they returned. And Ellen, I wanted to follow up with you on that, because you are the one who had a line that just really stuck with me in the film, which is that this Asian myth of being the model minority was actually a liberal creation. And it just is so different from how we currently understand it. And it really speaks to the complexity and the tension of how sometimes good intentions can have unintended consequences and then eventually be weaponized or hijacked in a way that is bad for the original intended recipients of the benefit. So you provided some amazing historic perspective during the film, but you're also on the ground today having really interesting experiences as an Asian American. I never would have thought there's a Asian protest in Indianapolis. It's just not an obvious thing that one would guess, not an obvious place that one would guess they would be organizing. So I want to hear your thoughts on not the past, but the future, and some of your scholarship that's still coming out, which is like I'm paraphrasing with the assumption that you'll correct all of my gross inaccuracies, but that Asians can serve a really pivotal role, that we're kind of in this the middle swing, and we can turn history one way or another if we mobilize effectively. What do you mean by that? What are you seeing on the ground today, and what are you finding in your studies of how we can really be in an empowered position today to make a difference?
Okay, thanks, Heaven. I'm taking lots of notes. I was just writing down a lot of notes too from Mike. But I just make sure you're asking about how we move forward and things on the ground. I do think that, at least from my personal experience right now, you're right. I'm part of a small, but I think very dynamic group of Asian American women who've been working in Indiana over the last couple of years in our National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum Indiana chapter, to really mobilize our communities and think about racial and gender justice in a very broad way. So I do think that a couple of things that come to mind, first of all, is that how we define what is an Asian American concern or AAPI concern, if you frame it like that. Think about it in a very elastic way, that, and I think once we take a broad view, we'll just naturally see that we share a lot of common ground with other communities, with just all kinds of other communities, as I say in the documentary, right? That everybody wants, a safe place to live and good schools for their kids and access to reliable healthcare and, the 3 square meals and all that. So I think there's plenty of common ground that we want to identify. So I do think on the ground, the best tool we have, and I've been writing about this right now in terms of the book I'm working on right now, I still think that the best tool we have is democracy, however flawed it may be. And with that kind of democratic engagement, I thought one line that stuck out to me from the film was Cynthia Choi saying our communities have, not been invested in enough. And so I think one way we want to turn that around is to invest in ourselves and think about ourselves and the kinds of engagement we can have in the democratic process, I think, regardless of citizenship status. And that involves playing the long game, right? We saw a really great example in Georgia over the last election cycle with Asian American communities really stepping up and in concert with other communities of color. And I think that we can be inspired by that example in other parts of our country and think about putting into office elected officials who truly represent the concerns of our communities and will, craft policy that I think really supports our visions of racial and gender justice.
Thank you so much for that, Ellen. And John, kind of following up on that, I wanted to ask your views on unpacking what it really meant for us to kind of go back towards our communities. Because I think as a filmmaker, you had to make some editorial choices. And because I have the privilege of knowing you off the camera, I know that those choices weren't due to lack of concern or lack of care and deep investment in those other communities. But when you were making this film, how did you try to focus in on an audience? Who was the audience that you were trying to reach, and how do you hope that audience kind of takes forward the messages and the historic teachings of your film to reach both groups of people that are identified in the film, which are other Asians that are not East Asians for whom this model minority myth was created, and then separately are other brothers and sisters of color who are not part of any AAPI community.
So, for any filmmaker, there are always very difficult choices that have to be made based on the amount of time and resources that are available. And for this film, and admittedly, right, I wasn't able to get representation from every API community, absolutely. And again, I've been advocating for the API community for many, many decades, so I understand how important representation is. But what I chose to do, and what I had to honestly kind of force myself to do, was to really stay laser focused on the model minority narrative, right? And how that has evolved and how it's really brought us to this moment where there are these divisions between communities of color. And that was really the story that I wanted to tell with this particular film. And I think, what I hope comes out of this, and what I hope, the audience takes away, is that there are really hard, difficult conversations that we need to have within our communities, right? Like a lot of the energy has been focused on protesting and drawing attention to the anti-Asian hate that's been taking place across this country. And a lot of that has been focused outwardly. But I think part of the path forward is a need to focus inward. And how do we address, admittedly, some of the biases we have within our own communities that have created these divisions? And I'm seeing one of the questions about, how do we address anti-Asian hate without harming other communities of color? And I think, what I know many have engaged in over this last year is really being intentional about becoming allies to each other. How do we lift up issues that may have nothing to do with the Asian American community, but it has everything to do with addressing systemic racism in America? Because as Ellen said, there are many, many issues and common ground we can find to collectively stand up and help address systemic racism as communities of color. And I think that's the approach that I took with this film, and what I hope people will take away from it.
And how does that look when you are intentional? I hate to press you too personally, but I know that you not only have these conversations with your personal friends and family, but also in the community as part of being an executive director at a nonprofit. So what does it look like to act out and to externally push yourself not to participate in the model minority myth? And can you just give us some examples of how we can do that?
Well, I think, part of you saw some of the footage at the very end of the film, and why I was drawn to including that was those were incredible examples of individuals not being the model minority. For example, I've been a big admirer of Mike and his work with Tsuru for Solidarity, because they relentlessly advocate for communities that are being targeted and oppressed, that are, many of which are not are not API, and for the API communities that they're advocating for, they are ones that are being oppressed and targeted, like many of the undocumented Asian Americans in this country. And so I think there are so many examples of ways in which we can engage in behaviors that are pushing back against the model minority myth. I think it's one thing to speak out, but it's also something entirely different, and something we have to think critically about is how do we stand up for other communities, right? And at periods of time when, even times when we are being targeted and when we're not being targeted, how do we become allies where people will feel like they can trust us to have their backs and to work collectively together? I think that's part of the work that has to be done. It's not easy work. It takes a tremendous amount of time to build relationships, to connect with folks, to meet people as leaders come and go in our communities. But that's something that I'm very focused on, that I have to be very intentional about, and really have to focus a significant amount of time on building and maintaining those relationships, so that when crises do come, we already have a natural relationship, a way to connect with each other and to really, stand up for each other.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really powerful credit scene. And I do have to ask you, Mike, were you arrested? And can you tell us more about what that protest was and how you do what John is talking about? Like, how do you build the credibility, and how do you kind of wrestle with on your, like, for yourself and also those you hope to inspire, like the personal risk that comes along with being an ally, for sacrificing your place or your privilege in the model minority myth? Can you address those?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, John. Well, first of all, that clip was from Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and that was in the summer of 2019, when the Trump administration was, who, by the way, are not the only administration, both Democratic and Republican administrations have targeted immigrants for detention. And so we were at Fort Sill in Oklahoma to prevent them from bringing 1,400 unaccompanied immigrant children to be mass incarcerated at that Army base. And so our concentration camp survivors and descendants like myself, we went there to prevent that from happening. And that's what that clip is about. And just to kind of to play off of what John was speaking about, in this issue around what does it mean to be an ally in this moment to other communities, I think it's really important to really challenge this idea of being sort of in the savior complex, because we've seen that played out in immigrant rights. I've seen that played out a lot by very well-intentioned, but often somewhat unaware sort of Christian moderates who come down to the border and they want to help the dark-skinned people, the poor children there. And I've seen a lot of unaware sort of insensitivity and arrogance, frankly. And so when I show up and when Tsuru engages in these actions, I really, and I think we've done we've tried anyway, very hard to be very intentional about how we are engaging in those spaces. And one thing is that we're not there to save anybody. We're actually there to correct and heal our own selves and our own community, because we also experience some of these harms. And it turns out that when you stand in solidarity, in transformative solidarity with other communities, that you actually heal yourself. And so save yourself. That's sort of what my inner conscience says to me, is save yourself first. Like, in other words, clean up your own house. And to that point, there was that great question in the chat about how do we sort of not harm other communities while we're actually fighting back against anti-AAPI hate. I have a sort of a good example of that. There's been a lot of violence targeting AAPI folks in New York City, where I live. And the FBI approached, or the Japanese embassy approached the FBI and invited them to have a community meeting, and all of the organizations were invited. And the New York Day of Remembrance Committee was opposed to this meeting, and I went. I went as an individual. I didn't go as part of the NYDOR committee because they really just didn't want to participate in this. But I felt it was important for someone to go and say, it's not okay to work with the FBI, who basically surveilled the Japanese American community, and then they removed our people in the middle of the night and took them away to concentration camps, much the way that ICE is taking people away from their homes in the middle of the night and detaining people right now in New York City. And so I went to that meeting and I stood up and I interrupted sort of a rah-rah, we're so happy you're here to protect us conversation, because I think a lot of the who were mostly immigrant Japanese folks in that room felt scared and underprepared to handle the violence of the United States. And the FBI was offering to be their protector. And actually, what we know, if we've been in here in this country longer, is that the FBI is not acting as a protector for communities of color. And in fact, they've waged many campaigns, counterintelligence project campaigns, against communities of color, and have destroyed leadership and have undermined leadership of our communities to really uphold a white narrative. So I thought it was just important for someone to stand up and say, we're not going to work with you. And I think more of us need to do those kinds of things. I think it comes back to trying to get right by ourselves and trying to act with principle and valid action.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating lived experience, and I'm really glad you were in the room to provide that counterbalance and that history. And it's something that I wanted, Professor, I wanted to ask you about too, because it's something that came up in the film, is that the more recent immigrant communities just don't have that same historic context, because they don't have the lived experience of being subject to the Chinese Exclusion Act or subject to the Executive Order 9066. So for the newer communities who are kind of reacting to the more current events, they're seeing violence on the ground today without the full context of American history. It's a different kind of challenge talking to them and reaching that, kind of reaching both their current interests as well as couching it all in a historic context. So I think what I wanted to ask you is if you could give us some historic examples of where our solidarity, either with all other AAPI communities, both the models East Asian and the non-model AAPI communities, or with generally BIPOC communities of color, where solidarity actually was what carried the day. And so just basically to arm us with that good narrative of, the rising tide lifts all ships.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Heaven. I'll try to unpack that a little bit. I mean, I'll just clarify too. My parents didn't come to the United States till the late 1960s, early 70s, and I, did not. Our family did not live through those examples that you mentioned, but certainly I have learned about that history. But your question is, what are some examples that we can point to about moments of solidarity? I hope I heard you correctly.
Yes.
Yes. So I've actually been researching and writing about right now for a new project I'm doing. In the film, John has a very brief clip of Mike Masaoka, who's very infamous, I think, in Asian American history, as somebody who advocated for Japanese Americans to go along, cooperate with authorities during World War II and the incarceration experience. But what I found is that in my research, the Japanese American Citizens League and Masaoka, it's complicated. And so one example of how actually the same exact organization worked in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s on really in a lot of ways, the top priority for the Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement, going back to World War II, and that is anti-Semitism discrimination in employment, what they called fair employment practices. And for 2 decades, the Black freedom movement activists, and I would say very actively the Japanese American Citizens League, worked very hard to get the federal government to pass a law that would put into place, a federal agency that would oversee and make sure to enforce anti-discrimination in employment. And they were sort of shot down over and over by segregationists. But one of the, again, unintentional outcomes of that effort actually gave rise to affirmative action policy. So it's a really interesting moment, because I have evidence of the Japanese American Citizens League, and this is not just at the top, but ordinary members across the country, in Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, and so forth, people showing up to make sure that there's going to be a way that Black folks and Mexican Americans, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans can make sure they have a fair shot at employment without encountering this discrimination that all these communities have been encountering. And some of that was also tackling issues like the filibuster, and different democratic challenges that I guess enabled white supremacist employment policy. So that's just one example I think very few of us know about yet. I'm learning about it, but I'm very excited to share with everybody.
Wow, that is fascinating. Just internally at that single organization, we have kind of the play out of the tension and the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
Well, I could listen to all of you, and I probably will, after my legal career is over, I'm going to become a student again to take your classes, Ellen. But unfortunately, I have to ask you all for a send-off for kind of a last takeaway. And just if you could lead us off, Mike, I wanted to ask a two-part question, which is just kind of thematically, what do you really hope to be able to convey to everyone who's online right now? Like, what are the high-level principles that you want people to kind of hold in their minds and hearts as they go about their day after this? And then the second part is a more specific question. If you could give us an example of something you've done, like a concrete act that you've undertaken in the past year or two to really make a change, as small or big as it was.
Sure. Well, just as a takeaway, what I would ask people to think about is the growing disparity of wealth in the country, because I think you can't separate class and race issues when you talk about inequity. And I live in New York City, and there are billions of dollars spent on law enforcement. And the Black community is saying that one of the issues for them is how the carceral system has targeted Black lives and Black bodies, really from the beginning of this country. And we need to change this. And so one thing we can do is demand a reappropriation of funds away from a militarized enforcement and carceral system that's actually profiting a lot of people and at the expense of Black and brown bodies. And we need to move a priority of funding away from the carceral system and towards communities of color. And I will include, as Cynthia Choi in the film said, we are underfunded as well. So I saw a statistic recently that of all of the foundational giving in a year, about 8% goes to communities of color, and about 0.3% of that goes to AAPI communities. So again, I always like to come back to a rising tide lifts all boats. We need to demand a reprioritization of how resources are allocated in this country, away from militarization and the carceral system, and back towards people and communities that have been most left out of the equation around inequity of resource, and also to support immigrant communities who often don't have voting rights and don't have a say in the democratic system. about how policies and decisions affecting their lives and their communities are made. So I guess for those of us who have privilege in this moment, who have proximity to the white power structure, we need to actually think about how we use that privilege. And in the spaces where we are the only ones, the only people of color, then we need to demand that other communities be represented there, and we need to get our foot in that door and hold it open and get more people in. In terms of an example, you know, I'm not going to say big examples. I'm going to say every day I'm trying to figure out what's one thing I can do today to try to make my interactions move the equation more towards equity for everybody. And if I can do one thing in a conversation, listening to somebody, making a suggestion, or holding space, bringing people who haven't been heard into a conversation, then I'm going to do that. And I think everyone can do that, actually. So I'm hoping that we can move forward together.
Thank you. Excellent points. Excellent mindfulness reminder as well on a daily basis. Ellen, could I ask the same of you?
Sure. Heaven, can you just repeat the question, please?
Yeah. So, yeah, can you? What is the high level send off, the message, the principles that you want the audience to take away from today, from your film, your participation in the film, on your academia, and on an individual level, what are some concrete examples, big or small, that you've done in the past year or two to try to move the needle towards a fairer society?
Okay. Yeah, high level principle. I think I'll just go back to the point about, democracy and power. I think we have a lot of potential in our communities. We have numbers, which in a democracy, can favor you, of course. I think we have a lot of creativity. We have a lot of energy. So those are all, great assets that we have to make the kinds of changes that Mike was talking about. But as far as a concrete example, I do think, again, working locally, in our town, there's some really great energy right now organizing around issues of food justice. And I think, and that is like looking really micro level. So, looking around you, finding what's nearby. And also, I would just, one quick thing too, I do think living places, for those Asian Americans who don't live around other Asian Americans and you feel lonely, my heart goes out to you. But there's also some great opportunities through digital organizing. And, I've just attended a workshop by 18 Million Rising. So there's all kinds of ways to connect to people, with our technology too. So that's pretty exciting.
Thank you so much for that. Not last but not least, our esteemed filmmaker, John. What are your? Can I ask the same of you? Your big takeaways, and then your call to action, even big or small, based on your own experiences.
Sure, absolutely. I would say that my big takeaway is that, and I truly believe that, as Asian American communities, when we are only advocating for ourselves, we are not building the type of power that's going to be necessary to withstand the next national emergency when we are targeted and scapegoated as communities. And I mean that very sincerely, that it is important that we stand up for ourselves, that we advocate for our issues. But in order to build the type of power, political and otherwise, to withstand the next time we are targeted and blamed for something happening in this country, we have to have allies from other communities. And I just really want to impress upon everybody how important that is as a strategy and a way forward. And it really has to start, and I sound like a broken record, but it really has to start with conversations in our own communities. I took that from Mike said that in the film, and I believe that very intimately. And I also believe something else that was said, and that by many of the interviewees, and that is, we have to be also mindful not to demonize people in our own communities who think differently. And I'll leave you with this one example, just to give a quick plug to another one of my films. I've made a film called Reparations, about the Black reparations movement, and I screened it publicly recently. And when I was walking out of the theater, this older Asian man approached me, and he said, you know, I'm having a really difficult time with this idea of reparations for the Black community when there are so many Black people attacking Asians. And my first instinct was to scold him and to lay into him a little bit, and that is just factually not correct. But I took a step back, and I just had a conversation with him, and starting with the fact that of all the data that's been gathered, the vast majority of these attacks are being committed by white males. They are not being committed by Black people. Those are just the ones that the media is showing over and over again. And he knew that. And we also talked about the fact that if we lifted up everybody, wouldn't there be less reasons to commit crimes and more opportunities to work collectively together for the betterment of all of our communities? And so that was the conversation we had, and he just listened. And when we were done, he walked away and he said, you know, I'm going to really think about the things that we just talked about. And I really believe that those are the conversations that we need to have within our own communities to really address our own biases, the ways in which we allow the media to manipulate how we view other communities, and that it really has to start there, and that we have to take every moment, big or small, to reach out to other communities, to hold gatherings, to do events together, and to find ways to build relationships that will ultimately lead to the power we need to withstand the next time society wants to blame us for something. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. What an incredible example. To get him even to a maybe is wonderful, because you got him thinking, and that's about as good as you can get anyone, is just really engaged with these tough issues. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much to the organizers of Voices, and thank you especially to John for putting together this wonderful piece of work, both historical and artistic, and also to our panelists, Mike and Ellen. Your participation in the film was so meaningful, and it was an honor to be able to extend the conversation further today. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks, Mike and Ellen.
Congratulations.